The haunting in Connecticut began in 1986 when the Snedeker family moved into a historic home at 208 Meriden Avenue. This is truly a wild story, and whether or not it's true, well, I'll leave that up to you. The Snedeker family were like any other middle-class American family. They were a family that struggled in a lot of ways. Their father, Alan, was a former stonemason who was suspected of having struggles with alcoholism. His wife and mother of the children, Carmen, was a waitress in between jobs, and finances definitely became a difficult situation. The family was comprised of Carmen Reed, her husband Alan, and their 4 children, Philip, Bradley, Alan Jr., and Jennifer. Carmen's niece, Tammy, also lived with the family. At an early age and during a visit to the doctor, a lump was discovered on Philip's neck, and he was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, a malignancy that affects the lymphatic system of the body, which is a rare and sometimes deadly cancer that attacks the body's immune system with intensity, and he was basically given 6 months to live. He was already a shell of a boy he once was, having deteriorated from a healthy young man. Philip had to visit a hospital in Connecticut and a specialist more than 300 miles away from the family home in order to receive experimental treatments. As Philip's treatment started, the family quickly came to realize that the 8-hour round-trip travels were becoming intolerable, not only for the family members who were taking Philip, but also for Philip himself, who was growing weaker due to the radiation and the cancer. Alan and Carmen decided to liquidate what was left of their assets because they wanted to do everything in their power to ease the burden and get their son closer to his doctors so that he had a fighting chance. While Alan takes care of the kids at home and files for a transfer to move with his company to a different state, Carmen travels to Connecticut in an effort to locate a suitable place for her family to live. However, with their budget, this isn't the easiest task to complete, given their combined family of 4 and 2 adults. They were getting desperate after dozens of rejections and appointments. That is, until she was thinking about what lay ahead, and she happened to drive by another house. Carmen just so happened to pass a big house with a sign in the front yard that said, "For rent." When the owner of the property asked her to come in, she gladly accepted and went inside. She could also take a tour of the house, even though renovations were still ongoing, and it would take some time before it was ready for habitation. She fell in love with the house right away. It seemed to be calling to her with its recent installed hardwood flooring and cozy interiors. It felt like the ideal fit, too, with 4 bedrooms, 2 upstairs and 2 downstairs, and enough room and space for everyone. The main factor, of course, was that it was conveniently located near the hospital, a fact that was even more significant. Carmen decided to ask the property owner directly how much the rent would be, fearing that the large size of the house would be far beyond their means. As it turns out, it was also exactly within their budget. Before too long, after shaking hands on the first day, Carmen signs the terms and moves in. They now have a fighting chance for the family to return to some semblance of normalcy, and even a better chance for their son Philip to overcome his cancer. After a few weeks, the kids are staying with relatives. Carmen and Alan start to organize the house. Alan, who is viewing the house for the first time, concurs that, considering the circumstances, his wife did an excellent job, and that the house would be a suitable match for the family. That is, until the pair take a peek at the lower level basement. There's a small room now that Carmen hadn't noticed during her first tour, maybe one that was under renovation at the time. The Snedekers reveal a horrifying discovery. Their new rental house, which they had just moved into to give their son a fighting chance against his cancer, looks to have once been a funeral parlor, a place where the deceased are prepared for burial. As they realize this, they soon discover that some of the old saws and tools are still in the room. At first, Carmen is shocked and upset with herself, so she declines to take the kids, Philip in particular, there. However, Alan talked her down, telling her to think about the circumstances, the agreement that they had just signed, the fact that they used every dollar for Philip's treatments, and the fact that nobody probably died there, even if it was a funeral home. Finally, Carmen gives in and consents to carry on with the relocation process. The couple promises not to tell their kids about the dark history of the house or anything in it. They get in touch with the landlord, who takes out the embalming and preparation supplies. A few weeks later, the rest of the family moves in, and while Philip and the other kids explore each room of the new home, Carmen starts mopping the floors in order to get ready to bring in the furniture to finish the move. However, as she starts to map out where items will go and fills the bucket with hot water and soap, she feels unease. The steaming soapy water starts to solidify, becoming a thick, dark red liquid resembling dried blood. She blinks quickly as the liquid smears all over the hardwood floor. Things appear to be returning to normal all of a sudden, and the strange vision is chalked up to be caused by extreme stress and tiredness. She tries to brush off the incident and carries on mopping. Philip, in the meantime, has ventured into the basement stairwell and is starting to descend the steps when he senses chilly presence enveloping him. As he descends further into the basement and looks around, he senses a menacing presence staring at him. Suddenly, he hears a voice calling from a particular room. He returns upstairs, shaken and scared, and greets his mother in the kitchen. He tells her that he doesn't think any of them are safe and that they should leave right away. At first, Carmen dismisses her son's emotions, blaming it on his illness, his adjustment to the new environment, and the fact that he is hearing an inner voice rather than a physical one. She would come to see that she was, in fact, incredibly mistaken. As the days grew longer and more challenging, the family started looking to their faith for direction. In an attempt to aid Philip's healing, Alan and Carmen reached out to the priest who had married them and asked him to offer a healing prayer over Philip. But in spite of everything they've tried, he only was getting worse. Officially, the whole family has moved in, and they all reside in the former funeral home. However, nobody has revealed to the kids that this was actually a funeral home. The rest of the family was unaware that Philip had discovered this on his own. In the end, Carmen would explain his discovery by saying that he was so close to passing away that she thought her boy's perception of life and death had become so thin that he was able to see what others were blind to, and possibly even know things that others did not. Alan has since tried to work, doing his best to provide for his family, leaving Carmen to manage the unfamiliar and new home alone, along with their ailing son. Notwithstanding the horrors of having a child with cancer, he would spend his weekends at home until his transfer was complete. The oddity inside the house gradually emerges from the shadows as the days go by. As the wind whistles outside, the Snedeker's youngest daughter is playing with her toys in her room. She converses with the dolls and puts them inside the dollhouse. When the young girl looks up above her dollhouse, she sees a figure in her room. She spots a silhouette of a pale-skinned woman screaming. She sprints as quickly as she can to her mother. Carmen gives the poor trembling girl comfort. She clings to her mother, wanting her to console her. Carmen goes upstairs to try and dispel her daughter's fears, but nothing seems out of the ordinary, leading her to believe that Philip and his brother were playing tricks on her little sister. Carmen rushes angrily to confront them. Despite her rage, the boys swear that they never told her the secret Philip had discovered, and that neither of them had played any tricks on their little sister. Perplexed, she corrects them and returns to the kitchen to prepare the family dinner. Lately, it feels as though she seems to find peace only at night, when the children are fast asleep in their beds. Her boys in the basement were not sleeping at all, even though she thought all of her children were sound asleep and the house was very quiet. The boys frequently wake up to the sounds of movement behind the closed door, followed by visuals of someone or something moving. When one of them would be the only one awake, They initially assumed it was just shadows, or their imagination playing tricks on them. However, now that it was the two of them, they were both witnessing the same thing and feeling the same shiver running down their spines. Then, as brothers often do, the two would confide in each other and everything that had happened to them personally. The days became longer and more stressful as time went on after the strange specter appeared. Philip's lack of sleep was making him more and more weak, feeling as though he was knocking on death's door. The boys eventually can no longer hold in their fears. They now come up to Carmen and tell her what they've been seeing, including the presence of the man. Carmen dismissed the boys' concerns as the product of their hyperactive imaginations, reminding Philip that his illness might have contributed to his perception of what actually wasn't there. This was Carmen's usual way of dealing with the growing demands and responsibilities of their daily lives, and trying to dissuade them of their fears. That would still not account for his brother having the same exact experience at the same moment, though. One more ordinary day in their new existence, Carmen starts preparing the family's dinner. She hasn't had any experiences that she deems to be genuinely paranormal up until now. She had just finished setting her family's table with all of the dishes. She hears a faint movement coming from the dining room. As she makes her way to the freezer to retrieve the food she'll be cooking for the family dinner. She sets the meat down in the kitchen after grabbing it. As she investigates the noise, she discovers that every dish has vanished completely, like she was losing her mind, as if she had never set them down at all. Carmen knows she set the table, so she can't brush this experience off with such ease. Bobby, Philip's younger brother, was downstairs in their room in the meantime. He is aware that there is an unexplainable strange happening in the new house. Given the apparitions and noises they've heard and experienced together, as well as whatever their younger sister has seen, the experience appears more personal. He starts hearing whispers coming from the lab room, and he sees the apparition of a man behind the closed window door. Other than the general outline in his size, he can't make out any features. However, the whispering gets louder the closer he gets. As this man, this thing that is slowly muttering the name Philip, overwhelms the boy with fear and makes him run upstairs, where he runs into his mother, who has just come through her own ordeal. She's unsure on how to respond to him. Taking his hand, they head to the lab room, where the whispers were coming from in the basement. Carmen opens the door after a tense few seconds, but there is silence. Until now, she's accepted the existence of the spirit world, but not its ability to communicate with the material world. But she wasn't so sure anymore, considering what her kids had been telling her, and what she had just gone through that very night. She had to entertain the possibility that her home might actually be haunted. The next morning, Alan would arrive to spend the weekend with his family. As he arrived, the winter storm starts to blow in. He believes that it's crucial to address this matter with his family after consulting with his wife and learning that Philip has informed the other kids about the eerie history of the house. He finally tells the family that they were in fact living in an old funeral home, but that there was no need for the kids to be afraid, that there were no monsters hiding in the shadows or ghosts of otherworldly beings observing them. Believing that the information might be freeing the hyperactive imaginations at the breakfast table. Once again, Philip and his brother are disregarded despite their contention that they had just witnessed and experienced the same things and that they are in fact very real. Alan would later pull Philip aside, being that he was the oldest of the kids, and encourage him not to scare the other children with ghost stories, and instead set an example for them. Day by day, Philip's cancer treatments wear him down and gradually deplete what little money the family has left. He keeps witnessing and experiencing more unexplained phenomena in the house in the meantime. His mother blames this on his illness and the way his body reacts to the medication he is taking. Another strange development has recently occurred. Most, if not all, of the family crucifixes that have been placed throughout their home have started to disappear, with no clue as to where they have gone. By now, Philip and his brother's nightly disturbances have also become routine. They are seeing and hearing other apparitions circling them as they lay in bed, and they are seeing the man in the lab room more and more often. It's the same tonight. The boys' terrified screams awaken their parents. It's the man again. Alan ignores the boys' experiences and makes them go back to bed, after sweeping the house, making sure everything was locked, and concluding that nobody could have even possibly gotten in. Sick of not being taken seriously, the boys would start talking to each other in an attempt to console one another before they fell asleep. Carmen and Alan wanted Philip's doctor to look into any potential drug interactions because they thought he was seeing things because of his medication and then influencing the younger kids. The doctor would determine, after a multitude of tests, that there was nothing wrong with Philip and that couldn't be the reason for these things. A psychological issue was the sole other explanation, in addition to his cancer. To try and keep up with the growing debt the family was being buried in, Alan was now taking on any side work that presented itself, in addition to working every hour that he possibly could. In order to counter the monthly bills, Alan goes to each of their rooms and removes the light bulbs except for one, naturally feeling that he had a good reason to do so. However, at night, the lights that once gave them the sense of security and comfort would soon be part of a brand new supernatural fright. The Snedeker boys are sound asleep in their basement room when their overhead light abruptly flashes. They notice their little sister flicking the lights on and off as they search for the source. Despite the fact that there are no light bulbs in the sockets, they are still flashing on and off as they run towards her. The youngest brother chases her up the stairs, but she is too fast for him. Instead, he exits the basement door and runs right into his parents. But strangely, his mother informs him that she's been sleeping in her room for hours, and she would know because she had tucked her in and had not been near the basement. But he still doesn't believe her. He dashes upstairs and soon discovers her soundly sleeping in her bed. The fact that whatever this thing could assume the form of a family member has him even more terrified. While his brother is processing this horrifying realization, Philip hears a voice calling to him. Again from the lab room, waking him up, and sick of living in terror, Philip decides to confront whatever or whoever has been calling out to him and enters the room. When he opened the door and faced the entity that had been calling his name, the apparition appeared to him as a man with dark red, almost blood-filled eyes, and began to whisper to him about the home's history. Philip began to undergo a radical change in personality. He began to pull away and isolate himself from the rest of the family, insisting that he be left alone in the basement and that his brother Bobby move upstairs, making Bobby feel alienated from their once close and confiding relationship. The family has been praying for a miracle to happen despite the personality changes since the beginning of their struggle. Following several months of daily therapy, Philip's blood test results eventually returned to normal. Even though his cancer was in remission, he surprisingly doesn't seem to care. The family is getting ready to celebrate the good news later that evening, but they are also welcoming a guest for the first time since they moved in. Teresa, their niece, who had just arrived from New York. Her parents were divorcing in an unpleasant fashion, so they let her stay with them in order to help her make the most of the circumstances. Teresa, who hasn't seen the family in a while, starts to get used to them, but quickly discovers that Philip, with whom she had been close with in the past, isn't at the gathering. She'd eventually find him in the basement and notice something was off about him. He appeared darker, more angry, and nothing like the boy she remembered. He'd eventually tell her about the paranormal activity he and the others had witnessed in the house, and how his parents didn't believe him. This made him feel extremely isolated and alone. The activity had not simply stopped, but had gotten worse with each passing night. As he described the experiences to Teresa, from scratching on his door and inside his walls, to hearing his name called, to seeing apparitions of figures surrounding him, and also seeing and hearing a man in a suit with blood-red eyes call out. This man would also visit his bedside every single night and tell him things that his parents had said about him, awful and detrimental things. After that, he would tell Philip to act out and harm his own family. Only after a short while, Teresa noticed that Philip's hatred and malice had seemingly become part of the family's everyday existence. Soon, screaming matches and fights started happening regularly, especially between Philip and his father. In addition to Philip's loneliness and lack of credibility regarding his experiences, Alan seemed to be upset with Philip over the family's financial situation. According to Philip's diary, every night, as he tried to go to sleep, this creature would come visit him and put increasing pressure on him to commit terrible deeds. After a while, Philip gave up on wanting to leave his room. He would not retaliate against this force, and it pushed him to harm his family night after night and day after day. Teresa would later learn that Philip, that in addition to this, he started seeing dead and buried people in the basement, as though the man in the suit with the blood-red eyes had trapped them there. And if Philip did not listen and follow instructions, this entity would keep threatening to harm him. Philip attacked Teresa without warning as he would explain these most recent developments to her. He grabbed her arm and attempted to hurt her before she escaped and ran up the stairs to her Uncle Alan's arms. That's when the relationship fell apart, as she watched Philip effectively banished back to the basement. In the confines of her bedroom and on her bed, Teresa sobbed. Carmen would eventually give her a rosary because she thought it would soothe her. And that night, she wore this necklace to bed, but she would soon find this holy object turned her into a target rather than a source of comfort. Teresa was sound asleep when she felt the blankets being yanked away from her body. Just before he attacked her and struck her in the face multiple times, she opened her eyes to find Philip staring at her with a twisted smile. Thankfully, Carmen and Alan were moved by her screams and quickly calmed Philip down. Following this erratic sequence of events, Philip's violent behavior led to his eventual removal from the house. He was screaming and sobbing as he was taken from the house against his will and taken away for a mental assessment when the law enforcement and medical personnel arrived. He appeared to have no memory of what had just happened. Once the other kids are safely inside the house, Alan and Carmen follow the ambulance to the hospital, where they sign the papers that will allow Philip to be admitted for evaluation. But before he was taken into the hospital, he gave them both a foreboding warning. He went on to say, "Mark my words. Now that I'm out of the house, it'll be after you, and it will get worse." The Snedekers' somber drive home became a long one, shattered by what had just happened. Given the distance and weather they had to endure, by the time they returned home, Alan needed to get to work after dropping Carmen off. Even as he leaves for the day, Alan is aching to sleep. Sitting on the edge of her bed, Carmen is sobbing, and she considers what her son has just said. What if all of this was real, though? How on earth could they deal with that? When searching for something that is invisible, where does one begin? In an attempt to investigate, she makes the decision to go to Philip's room in the basement. She doesn't see anything, but after a few minutes, she does start to feel temperature drop dramatically to the point where she can see her breath. She soon starts to tremble from fear. She is unable to describe her struggle with these emotions. She challenges whatever might be lurking there to show itself, to prove that it was real, that it truly existed. Despite her challenge and half-hour wait, she sees nothing, so she returns upstairs to her room to take a shower in an attempt to relax herself enough to sleep. Alan, meanwhile, has been making his way to work while driving in the dark. He is worried about his son, his family, and leaving them behind for the day as he drove. He wouldn't have known, after his lengthy drive, that these weren't the only issues he had to worry about in such an unprocessed and emotional state. When he does get to work for the day, he wants to divert his mind from his sleep deprivation and his family issues. While Carmen is taking a shower and the rest of the kids are sleeping, a terrifying presence starts to appear. The shower curtain suddenly covers Carmen's face, catching her off guard and out of breath, and begins to smother her. At the same time, Teresa's startled and awake. She's being strangled by the rosary she's wearing. She screams, pulling at her neck, and eventually frees herself from it. She then runs towards the muffled screams of her aunt coming from the bathroom. After seeing her being strangled by the shower curtain, she pulls it off her as fast as she could. Then, after experiencing things that neither of them can explain, they both share a moment of extreme trauma and terror that has revealed to them in that moment. Alan is about to have an attack of his own. Even though his keys were in his pocket, he starts to hear his truck turn over. Glancing out to see what could be going on, he watches as his truck moves in the direction of his small work building and then rapidly accelerates as if someone had just stepped on the gas. And before he could get away, the truck crashes squarely into the structure, right into the spot where he was standing. Later on, as Carmen and Teresa return home, they are still in disbelief when all of a sudden the phone rings. But all Carmen hears is a muffled laugh coming from their other end. She drops the phone the moment she feels a burning sensation on her ear, only to discover it's partially melted. She starts to scream, but stops herself as she looks up at the ceiling. Teresa starts to scream as soon as she notices something out of the corner of her eye. Above them now hovered a black cloud of some sort. The sudden and horrifying manifestations of a supernatural evil that are occurring absolutely mortify the two, and they acknowledge that Philip was correct. The entire house is under the control of this force, this evil entity. Running hastily into another room after leaving the first, they scramble to get the remaining kids together. They appear to have no way out, though, with the malevolent storm raging inside and a snowstorm raging outside. She then receives another phone call, this time from a different landline in the house. Alan is on the end of the line. He explained what just happened and that he was waiting for the authorities to arrive, even more shocked and terrified now that this entity has attacked all the family members. Because all the events appeared to take place around the same time, she is convinced that the demon will follow them wherever they go. So, despite the fact that it is the middle of the morning during a winter snowstorm, she calls the only person she believes can help her in this desperate situation. She makes contact with the priest who married her and gave Philip a blessing prior to his cancer going into remission. Fortunately, the father answered the phone for their benefit, and he said that he would try to get to the house as soon as possible, considering the state of the roads. Thankfully, he does arrive after a few hours of delay. Priorities first. The father decides to talk to Carmen and find out the precise nature of the situation, and after talking to him about everything under the sun, they hope to find a solution to improve their circumstances, even though those are not simple. They are astounded by the father's reply. He assures them that while he does believe them, the presence and the actions will cease if they choose to ignore them. For Carmen, this is the first time she has lost all faith. His response has confused her. When something has attempted to take your life, how can you just ignore it? After he left, she scrambled to look for another unconventional way to get the answers she sorely needed, combing through several newspapers and phone books to see what she could do. She happened to come upon a story about a husband and wife team of supposed demonologists who were scheduled to speak at a local university. She makes several more calls to Lorraine Warren, and after talking with her husband and the possibility of the visit, Ed agrees to come see Carmen. That day, to assess her circumstances, finally comes. Following their arrival and a quick interview, Lorraine begins to examine the house with her gift of psychic abilities. The purported extra sense that enables one to discern the real nature of an object, a person's nature, or, in this case, a spirit that is haunting the house. She has had no prior knowledge of the house and was almost instantly drawn to the basement. She makes her way to the infamous lab room and soon detects a swarm of beings. A horrible sense of depression and doom began to fill her entire being. Among the many human spirits she sensed was something sinister and sickening. The basement was inhabited by an evil force. She later describes the sensation as if it was a portal to hell itself, located in the room to expel any such spirits from the house. Carmen was informed by the Warrens that the Catholic Church would have to authorize an exorcism and send the necessary personnel to make this happen. The Warrens asked their lead researcher, John Zaffris, to come in and document everything that is discovered so that a proper report can be submitted to the church. John and his team temporarily move into the house to try to document anything that will help prove beyond a reasonable doubt that an exorcism is indeed required to help this family. They relied on video, audio, and photographic evidence to document their findings during their time there. The Warrens' advice was to prevent the demon from isolating any one person in the family. The entire family moves their beds into the living room at night to protect one another and sleep together. Fortunately, because the researchers were also temporarily residing there at any given time, there was also an additional person with the member of the family. However, now that Philip has left, the entity begins to pursue the next most vulnerable person, who has been subjected to intense stress as a result of the entire situation. Given that her son was in a psych ward, her family, dynamic in its shambles, and the bills were never ending. In addition, Carmen was overcome with guilt for not believing any of her children, Philip in particular, about what they had gone through during the entire ordeal, and it appeared that maybe the entity took advantage of this for its own gain. Around their living room fireplace, the family were discussing possible discoveries with the Warrens and their researchers when Carmen was abruptly thrown backwards, and everyone gathered around her. Her face started to twist and contort, her throat started to bulge, and their expressions changed from ones of concern to ones of horror. She would later talk about the feelings she had during this. She described the experience as being like being in a well or a dark hole surrounded by black figures whose features she couldn't see. She states that she was so overcome with hopelessness and despair that she knew she deserved to stop breathing. The Warrens and their team hurried to her aid and, unable to carry out an exorcism on their own, asked the rest of the family to bring anything holy so that they could lay it on her. Teresa scrambles to locate the rosary that she was gifted, the same one that Carmen thought would keep her safe. It was put on her to try and stop whatever was attacking her. After hours of prayer, asking the group's intercession, and the replacement of the rosary, it appeared to work. At least momentarily, breaking the spell Carmen was under and bringing her back to consciousness. Lorraine informed her that she had been under attack for the past 8 hours, but she had no idea how long she had been unconscious. For Carmen, the experience seemed to last only a few minutes while they were praying over her. Still, those were the longest minutes of her life. After a few more weeks, the researchers and the Warrens eventually gathered enough proof and that their perspective to give to the church. However, they, like the rest of the family, were exhausted at night. They slept on mattresses next to the family in the living room around the fireplace. Their mattresses would breathe an alternate breath, not only waking and frightening them, but also acting as if they were living, breathing creatures being laid on. Despite the fact that they had investigated and dealt with dozens, if not hundreds, of paranormal cases, they believed that what they encountered at the Snedeker's home in Connecticut was by far the most powerful demonic presence they had ever encountered, especially so close to what was supposed to be the final night. When researcher John Zaffreys was abruptly awakened from a deep sleep, he made the mistake of leaving the safety of the living room and sitting in the kitchen, unable to fall back to sleep. He felt as though he had been placed in a freezer within minutes. All of the warmth left his body, and he had noticed that his own breath hanging in the air. He knew he was being watched because he had been through this before. As fear gripped him, he began to call out to anyone and everyone sleeping just a few feet away in the living room, but received no response. He dashed into the living room and noticed the mattress breathing, but everyone who lay on them was completely unresponsive. He then hears the basement door creak open. As he walks slowly to where he can see the basement entrance, he notices a man in a suit with a contorted face and bloodshot eyes. This experience frightens John so much that he rushes into the living room, shaking his crew awake and telling them that they need to get out. He would go on to say that, "I have only spoken about this situation a handful of times since then, and the decades upon decades of paranormal research, they have never seen something to that degree of evil since that night." Days after John leaves the house, the Warrens finally persuade the Connecticut diocese to assign the family a priest to determine whether an exorcism would be granted in the Catholic faith. Even so, in the 20th century, exorcisms are only carried out in complete secrecy and are extremely rare. To be granted, evil must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt to exist. Using a range of techniques, even more uncommon is conducting an exorcism on a structure or location, as opposed to a person. Father Frank, a priest, shows up shortly after to carry out the church's directive to look into the matter on their behalf. After viewing the Warrens' evidence, he tours the Snedeker home and hears their account of their experiences. By the end of the interview, the family is unsure whether their father will advise the church to grant them what they so desperately believe they required. Several agonizing weeks would pass before word came from the church and the family that they had decided to grant them an exorcism. Father Richard, another priest, was assigned to carry out the ritual. When Father Richard arrives during a particularly bad storm, he is almost immediately drawn to the basement. As he calmly descends the steps behind him, he senses something truly evil lurking within the shadows. In a matter of seconds, he enters the lab and shuts the door behind him so that he could start tossing holy water droplets into the area. The air feels heavy, and the energy in the house feels as though it's getting darker. Father Richard felt the evil presence close by, but he carried out the ritual nonetheless. He performed the exorcism in each room while praising God's blessings, until at last he found himself in the living room with Ed and Lorraine Warren. Several hours later, as he neared the end of the ritual, the evil presence that had imprisoned the family reappeared. Since the beginning of this brutal winter in Connecticut, they had refused to be ignored and were ready for a fight by everyone present. All non-nailed-down objects in the room were sitting and began to shake and began to be thrown. As the snow and ice slapped the windows outside the house, books, trinkets, statues, and ornaments shattered. The more they prayed, the more intense the activity seemed to be, and more they seemed to provoke the entity. In the middle of the chaos, and everyone once saw, Teresa was propelled into the air and choked by what she would later describe as large invisible hands. The entity appeared to be trying to startle and disrupt the people in attendance who were praying, but Father Richard is not going to back down. Then, in a blink of an eye, whatever had been haunting the walls of the Snedeker home vanished. Despite the chaos that had engulfed them, they couldn't be more happier or grateful for their newfound freedom. A few days following the exorcism, they began the process of leaving the house in order to move on from their past experiences and avoid taking any chances that the door they thought they had closed with the aid of their faith would reopen and spark their own paranormal activity. After the exorcism, Philip would be released from the mental health facility about a month later. He appeared to not only be in stable condition, but almost much healthier. He was overjoyed to see his family again. Thankfully, his cancer would never return. There are conflicting theories regarding what happened to the Snedeker residents. For those who accept them, the exorcism was a great success. Even now, many years after their own deaths, the Warrens remain iconic figures. While some regard them as genuine demonologists and paranormal experts, others see them as nothing more than attention-seeking hoaxers. Unfortunately, Philip would go on to become addicted to drugs and eventually receive a diagnosis of schizophrenia anemia. In 2002, The Haunting in Connecticut, a dramatized documentary with an altered family names and hidden interviews of the family, was inspired by the story. It would be popularized by 2009 with the release of the horror film The Haunting in Connecticut. The Snedekers had no other paranormal activity in their lives after moving out in 1987. And the subsequent owners of the home have also reported no activity. Once again, the interpretation is entirely up to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this episode. Please leave a like if you enjoyed it, and also leave your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to notifications so you don't miss out on new videos. I truly appreciate all of you.